former flight attendant, unexpectedly reunites with a young black boy he once mistreated, only to find that the child, now older, carries a worn notebook documenting everything. Their fateful reunion 4 years later between a man seeking redemption and a boy still healing will leave you breathless. Can a belated apology mend what was broken? This powerful story won't let you look away. The digital clock above gate 17 ticked slowly to 11:23. IEM. Outside the thick window pane, a wide-body aircraft from Southern Skies Airlines was being gently towed into position. The midday sun at Dallas Airport wasn't harsh, but it cast grey-gold beams across the tarmac, as if the entire day pulsed to a rhythm different than usual. Chuck Norris, long past the age of caring about spotlights, sat quietly in the priority seating area. He wore a faded khaki jacket, scuffed but clean leather shoes, and cradled a small backpack in his lap. Next to him sat his grandson, Malik, a slender 6-year-old black boy with glasses, scribbling intently into a notebook. Malik didn't speak much, but he had a bright, inner world, captured in colored pencil sketches inside what he called his World Discovery notebook. A gift from his late mother. "Grandpa, do planes go faster than police cars?" Malik asked, eyes lit up as though he'd just proposed a grand scientific theory. Chuck smiled. "If the police are chasing me, maybe not." Malik giggled and wrote, "Planes can go faster than police if the police can't fly." They were a quiet pair amidst the buzz. No one recognized Chuck. No one paid attention. Years had passed since he'd stepped out of the public eye, choosing a quiet life raising his grandson after his daughter's tragic car accident. He didn't need people to know who he was. He only needed Malik to believe the world was still worth trusting. Flight 497, Dalish to Boston. Boarding began at 11:35. They were among the first to step into the business class cabin, a calm space of wide seats, white linen cloths and warm ambient lighting. Malik looked around with delight, dragging his grandfather to the window, pressing his face to the glass, fascinated by the workers handling fuel tubes, stairs, and silver luggage containers. Chuck helped him unstrap his backpack, buckle up, and tuck the notebook into the seat pocket. Everything moved with the ease of a long-held routine between the two of them. Soon, a man in uniform entered the cabin. His name was Bradley. Over 35, tall, classically handsome with slicked back hair, a pricey watch, and a stride like a runway model. His smile was well-trained, warm for VIPs, cold for those he deemed unworthy. When Bradley's eyes landed on seat 2, where Chuck and Malik sat, his smile faltered for a split second. An old man, a black child, in business class. His face betrayed surprise and perhaps a flicker of biased discomfort. Still, he approached them for a routine seatbelt check. "Sir, please ensure the boy keeps his seatbelt on at all times unless advised otherwise." Chuck nodded gently. "He understands." Bradley didn't respond. He moved on but muttered just loud enough for his colleague to hear. "I guess they let anyone up here now." The female attendant beside him, Nina, frowned slightly but said nothing. The flight took off smoothly. Malik stared out the window, sketching the sky and another plane flying parallel in the distance. He turned and whispered, "Grandpa, why do rich people sit in big chairs and poor people squeeze in the back?" Chuck looked at him for a moment, then spoke softly, more to himself than anyone else. "Because some people think value comes from price, but really it comes from how we treat each other." Malik nodded, then wrote another line in his notebook. "Big seats don't make people bigger." But the joy didn't last. While trying to retrieve a crayon that had slipped from his notebook, a magazine slid from Malik's tray onto the aisle. It was nothing serious. Malik quickly bent down to pick it up, but just then Bradley returned, and with a snap of irritation, he grabbed Malik's arm and yanked him back to his seat. Hey, sit still. You can't just drop things in the aisle. Malik froze. His small arm reddened under the grip. His wide eyes weren't filled with fear, but with something quieter, like a silent plea for permission to feel hurt. The cabin went still. No one spoke. Time seemed to pause. Chuck saw everything. He saw the way Bradley's hand clamped down. He saw that Malik didn't cry, didn't scream, just turned and looked at him with those eyes. Chuck said nothing. He simply pulled Malik's notebook closer, turned to a blank page, and whispered, "Write it down, Malik. Everything you see, everything you feel." Malik swallowed hard. His hand trembled as he picked up his pencil and wrote, "Some people don't want children in places they think only belong to adults." Malik didn't cry. There was no tantrum, no fuss. He simply froze for a moment, notebook in hand, eyes glistening but wide open, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His wrist showed a light red mark where Bradley had gripped him. No blood, but not all pain bleeds. Chuck remained silent, but his gaze, deep and unblinking like a still well, took in everything. Malik pulling his arm back, Bradley's indifferent walk away, the absence of an apology. No one nearby spoke up, but people began to sense something off. Middle-aged woman took off her headphones and glanced toward Malik's shaking hand. She slowly removed her sunglasses and looked at Chuck, waiting. Chuck didn't react. He simply leaned closer to Malik and opened the notebook again. "Blank page," he whispered, like a prayer meant only for the boy. "Sometimes you don't get to choose who sits next to you, but you always get to choose how you respond." Malik bent over his notebook and quietly wrote, "When they hurt me, Grandpa didn't get mad. He let me write it down, so I'd remember I wasn't wrong." Time slowed in the air. Or maybe it was Chuck's silence that made each second feel heavier. Bradley passed by their row several more times. Each time, he avoided eye contact with Chuck, but his gaze always flickered toward Malik, half reproachful, half dismissive. Across the aisle, an older man in a brown suit quietly pulled out his phone, not to record, but to open the Notes app, as if to log what had happened. The air in the cabin shifted. No one spoke loudly, no one asked questions, but all eyes began to orbit around a single axis, row 2, where a quiet old man and a child sat side by side. Nina, the only female flight attendant in the cabin, finally approached. She leaned in gently. "Sir, everything okay?" Chuck looked up. His eyes weren't cold, they weren't angry. They were simply deep enough to make people pause. "Yes," he said quietly, "but not everyone is." Nina paused. Then she looked down at Malik, who was now drawing something in his notebook. A simple image, a seat, a hand gripping a wrist, and a face without a mouth, a face that couldn't speak. Nina exhaled. She understood. She nodded gently and walked away, saying nothing. But something inside her shifted. A discomfort, like hearing a song played off-key. Passengers whisper like wind. An elderly Asian woman sitting behind Chuck gently tapped the shoulder of the person next to her. That was too rough for a child, wasn't it? The neighbor nodded. A few rows ahead, a young woman, maybe a college student, scribbled in her notebook. "Power doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from how we treat others." Everyone began to take note. No one yelled, no one protested, but the silence had begun to speak. Malik's question no one could answer. He turned to his grandfather quietly. "Grandpa, if I were someone else, would he have pulled me like that?" Chuck didn't answer right away. He looked at Malik for a long time, then said slowly, "Some people see others through their own frame, not through their eyes." Malik wrote, "Some people look at me through their mold, but Grandpa sees me with the truth." Bradley returned again, this time with a tray of water. He placed a cup on their table without looking. Malik whispered, "Thank you." No response, no smile. But this time a voice came from behind. Soft, but just loud enough for all to hear. He said, "Thank you." Bradley froze and looked up. It was the old man with the thick book. The boy? He said, "Thank you, just in case you didn't hear him." The air tensed. Bradley forced a smile. "Yes, of course, my apologies." But no one smiled back. Chuck remained seated, still, silent. His hand gently rested on Malik's shoulder, like an invisible pillow for a tender soul still aching. This was only the beginning. The shift in the cabin. The business-class cabin of Flight 4997 hung in a peculiar stillness. No shouting, no confrontation, but every breath seemed pressed under a quiet weight. Bradley, the flight attendant, continued working, walking back and forth with water trays, a courteous smile plastered on his face. But those paying attention could see. The smile had become forced. His eyes blinked more often. His movements grew stiffer. And each time he passed row 2, his steps faltered just slightly. Malik still sat quietly, like a small ebony carving. Notebook in hand, though his handwriting was now crooked. Not from fatigue, but from emotional weight. Chuck Norris remained beside him, silent as stone. He hadn't spoken since the incident. But the way he gently slid the water toward Malik, the way he softly wiped sweat from his grandson's forehead, that said, enough. At the rear of the cabin, Nina stood motionless. She had witnessed it all. Not like a surveillance camera recording angles, but like a human being absorbing the emotional hue of a room, turning shades of discomfort. A man in a grey sweater turned to his wife and whispered, "That boy didn't do anything wrong." The woman nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on Chu, as if waiting for him to speak. Boss, he didn't. And somehow, that silence accused more deeply than any words could. The first to stand. 27 minutes after takeoff, a young woman named Rosa, white, around 30, in a hoodie, sitting in seat 3A, rose quietly. She didn't head for the restroom. She didn't ask for water. She simply walked to Chuck's seat, placed a small pack of tissues on Malik's tray table, then returned to her seat. No one asked what she was doing, but everyone saw it. That small act was like a knock against the wall of silence. Bradley noticed, but pretended not to. He passed by again, fingers tightening around his coffee tray as though trying to suppress something. Shame, anger, fear? As Rosa sat down, Chuck nodded at her. No words. None needed. The nod said everything. Rosa took out her phone, not to film, but to open her notes app, and typed, "If I stay silent, I'm complicit." The arrival of Charles. At the back of the aircraft, Charles entered the business class section. Mid-40s, grey-hailed, calm demeanor. He was a senior attendant brought in to support coordination. It was corporate speak, meant to intervene quietly before any complaints escalated. But Charles had already heard whispers among the other crew members. As he walked in, his eyes scanned each passenger, and he knew something was wrong. Then he saw Chuck, and he froze. A jolt of recognition shot through him. "Is that him?" he murmured. Years ago, Charles had served as a young soldier. He had once met Chuck Norris at a military hospital. Chuck had shown up unannounced to visit injured veterans. No cameras, no press. Charles remembered that gaze, unassuming, yet unforgettable. And now he was staring into that gaze again, under very different circumstances. A second standing. Mr. Lewis, a retired schoolteacher in seat 2C, slowly stood and walked to Chuck's seat. He didn't say much, just placed a hand on the seat in front and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "Sir, I saw it, and I just want to say, you're not alone." Chuck looked at him. No nod, no smile. Just that quiet, mountain-like stare. Malik looked at Mr. Lewis with wonder, and for the first time in over half an hour, the boy smiled. Just a little. As Mr. Lewis returned to his seat, the cabin's mood changed. It was no longer simply quiet. It had become deliberate silence, filled with awareness. A shift had begun. Not a protest, not outrage, but the slow, unseen turning of human hearts toward a shared truth. Rosa glanced again at Chuck, then at Malik, who had stopped writing and was now just staring upward, eyes fixed on the plane's ceiling, deep in thought. For a 6-year-old, it was a hauntingly profound moment. And then Rosa whispered, barely audible, like a passing breeze, "Thank you, Mr. Norris." Chuck didn't answer. Didn't need to. But that name, Mr. Norris, clicked like a key turning in a lock. All heads turned toward Rosa. Did she just say Norris? Wait. Chuck Norris? From the back of the cabin, a middle-aged man murmured, "I thought I recognized that posture." A younger passenger pulled out their phone. No need to fact-check, just a quick Google image search. No confirmation necessary. The posture, the silence, the gravity. They all knew. Chuck Norris was on this flight, and he was the man Bradley had just belittled. At the front of the cabin, Bradley, now collecting empty water cups, felt it before he saw it. A chill ran down his spine. Not from the air conditioning, from the stairs. Every time he looked up, someone was watching. Not with accusation, but with quiet expectancy, as if they were waiting, not for Chuck to act, but for him. Bradley muttered, "They're blowing this way out of proportion." He glanced down the cabin and saw Charles standing at the far end. Bradley approached him, his voice urgent. "Charles, can you talk to the passengers? This is getting uncomfortable." Charles stared at him. "What did you do?" Bradley hesitated. "What do you mean, what did I do? The kid dropped something. I pulled him back to his seat. That's it." "Did you pull, or did you grab?" "I kept order. That's my job." Charles said nothing, but his look said, "Keeping order doesn't mean causing harm." The cabin stirs. Toward the back, a retired doctor pulled out his iPad and began composing a formal complaint. A family of 4, one child about Malik's age, walked back from the lavatory, clearly glancing at Chuck as they passed. A 17-year-old boy in a hoodie whispered to his friend. He hasn't even said anything, and everyone's listening to him. Chuck Norris had yet to speak. He hadn't even looked at Bradley. But when Rosa, Mr. Lewis, and the boy in the hoodie all rose again, almost unconsciously, everyone understood. Chuck didn't need to command. He only needed to be present. Nina turned to Bradley and spoke softly. "I think you should sit this one out." Bradley scowled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "They're not looking at us anymore. They're looking at him, and he hasn't said a word." Bradley retreated to the galley, flustered. His eyes darted restlessly. The hunger that never came. When lunch service began, something unusual happened. No one touched their food. They sat. They waited. But for what? An apology? A statement? A confrontation? Or just to see what Chuck Norris would do? Malik looked up. "Grandpa, why isn't anyone eating?" Chuck placed a hand on the boy's back. He didn't answer. He just smiled, gently, as if to say, some truths don't need to be explained. The final straw. Bradley cornered Charles once more. "This is ridiculous." "No," Charles replied. "What you did was, And now people are watching. So what? They'll forget. They always forget. Charles shook his head. Not this time, because this wasn't a scandal that screamed. It was a quiet truth. And those, they echo longer. Bradley's breath quickened. He hasn't even said anything. Charles met his gaze. That's what makes it worse. A declaration without sound. The cabin remained still. Those who had spoken were now quiet. Those who hadn't had started to think. Chuck Norris did only one thing. He took Malik's hand and placed the World Discovery notebook back in it. Malik wrote a final line. Grandpa doesn't need to speak so loudly because everyone is already listening. Flight 4997's business class felt as though an invisible hand was pressing down on it. Every word hung like mist, but each carried the weight of stone. The silence had become a manifesto. No microphone, no slogan, just eyes and understanding. Bradley passed row 2 again. His tray is now empty, but his shoulders were heavy. No one stopped him. No one scolded him. No one blocked his path. But with every step, it felt as if the passenger's eyes burned through his uniform, not because of who he was, but because of who he had failed to see. Chuck remained still, sometimes adjusting Malik's blanket. The boy had fallen asleep, notebook clutched to his chest. That image of trust, of peace, in the arms of someone who saw him, was a statue in the middle of a moral storm, and it was becoming the anchor for everyone on board. Charles moved closer to row 2. His eyes swept the cabin, not in panic, but in acknowledgement. He wasn't a man of many words. He had seen real fear in war zones and fake confidence in boardrooms. He had seen cowards yell when cornered, and true strength whisper when it mattered. And today, he was seeing it again, not on a battlefield, but in a pressurized cabin 40,000 feet in the air. Nina, the only flight attendant caught between company protocol and human decency, stood quietly beside him. She didn't know what to do. Part of her wanted to call ground control and file a formal report. Another part wanted to walk up to Chuck, bow, and apologize on behalf of everyone. But whatever she did, it wouldn't feel like enough. As the cabin lights dimmed for rest, Rosa rose again. She didn't head to the restroom. Didn't need water. She stood by Mr. Lewis's row and whispered, "I don't think I can sit still anymore." Mr. Lewis nodded, said nothing. He placed a hand on the seat in front of him and stood beside her. No plan, no cue, but they both knew it was time for something to shift. Rosa walked toward Chuck. She didn't intrude, just stood nearby, close enough for him to see her, far enough not to wake Malik. "My granddaughter's the same age," she said softly, voice steady. "If someone had done that to her, I might have screamed. But you didn't scream." And that made me realize, some strength doesn't come from the voice. It comes from being present. Chuck said nothing, but Malik stirred, and without opening his eyes, the boy's hand moved, touching the back of Chuck's hand, just to make sure he was still there. Charles watched the moment. He turned to Nina, nodded. They both moved toward the front galley. From their intercom radio, a message crackled. "Director Raoul is available on the ground. We're 10 minutes from initial descent." Raoul, the airline's executive director, was already waiting at Boston Logan. Internal reports had reached him. A sensitive incident had occurred. A notable passenger was involved. Bradley heard the transmission. His face drained of color. He turned to Charles, panic in his voice. "You called him?" Charles didn't answer directly. He simply said, "I didn't have to. Everyone has already done it." With silence, descent begins. Bradley looked around. The cabin was dim. Passengers sat quietly, but their eyes still watched him. No one yelled. No one filed past him in anger. But this was worse. They weren't asking for his job. They weren't demanding revenge. They were just done with him. He pulled out his phone. I tried to type a message, maybe to a friend in HR, but his fingers trembled. He glanced at Malik, still asleep, notebook pressed to his chest, and something inside him twisted. He saw himself as a child, not in resemblance, but in the difference. Malik had something he had never had, the faith that an adult would protect him. And Bradley had betrayed that. The captain's voice cut through the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing for our initial descent into Boston. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. The sign blinked on, but no one noticed. Everyone was waiting for closure. Malik stirred, rubbing his eyes. Grandpa, did we land? Chuck nodded gently, stroking his hair, but his eyes were already locked on the cabin door. When the door opened, the plane rolled to a stop. The door cracked open. A tall man in a dark suit with silver hair stepped on board. Raouf, CEO of Southern Skies Airlines. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He walked slowly, taking in every face. When he reached row 2, he stopped. He placed a hand over his heart, vowed deeply. Mr. Norris, on behalf of the entire Southern Skies family, I offer our deepest apologies. Silence. No applause. But the cabin warmed. Rawle turned to Bradley. Bradley, you are hereby suspended. An internal investigation will begin immediately. Bradley didn't argue. He had no fight left. He just lowered his head. Chuck stood. Still no words. He lifted Malik into his arms. The boy rested his head on his grandfather's shoulder. Rawle stepped aside. He didn't have to invite. He knew it was his duty to make way. As Chuck stepped off the plane, every passenger stood. Not out of admiration, not for fame, but for respect. They had just witnessed justice, not shouted, but carried out through presence, decency, and restraint. The next day, a sterile white room at Southern Skies corporate office hummed under fluorescent lights. On the desk, a stack of typed documents in bold. Preliminary passenger statements, Flight 497. Beside it, a second file, hand-marked. Attention, Legal Department. Bradley sat alone. A uniform. No trained smile. Just a rolled-up shirt sleeve and a slight tremble in his wrists. The events had unfolded like a flash flood, and now that the waters had receded, only one thing remained. The truth. He wasn't asked to justify himself. He wasn't given the usual explanation window. He was simply summoned to help the company assess the scale of what had occurred. But no one could force what was happening inside him. That was beginning to awaken on its own. Bradley reread the statements. No one used cruel language. No one called him a monster. No one demanded his termination. And yet, each line stung more than any insult could. I don't understand why he grabbed a child like that. The boy apologized twice. It was just spilled orange juice. The grandfather didn't have to speak. We all saw it. I didn't stand up for Chuck Norris. I stood up for a child who was treated cruelly. Bradley folded the file shut. His fingers locked together. He had once believed he'd become the perfect flight attendant. He memorized protocols. He perfected his smile percentages. He knew exactly how wide to open an overhead bin for visual symmetry. But he had never asked himself, am I someone a child would feel safe around? And now, the answer was no. Meanwhile, in Tex, in a modest home outside Dallas, Malik sat by the window. His world discovery notebook rested on his lap. He'd placed a new sticker on the page where he had drawn the big hand gripping the small hand. Below it, he wrote, "The pain isn't just from being pulled hard, it's from having no one speak up for you." He looked up at his grandfather, slicing apples, as usual. "Grandpa? Yeah. Did I write that sentence right?" Chuck smiled. "There's no right or wrong when you're telling the truth." Malik nodded, turned the page, and began sketching. Chuck, grey hair, soft eyes, hand in his. Nina's report. Nina sat in a quiet room, typing her official internal report. 3 hours passed before she neared the final paragraph. She paused, then wrote, "I used to think silence meant professionalism. After that flight, I learnt the right silence can be the strongest voice, but the wrong silence is complicity." The boardroom. At a private executive meeting, Raoul addressed the airline's leadership. "We are not just apologizing to a man, we apologize to a society, tired of small, daily wounds caused by subtle prejudice." One board member asked gently, "Will he sue?" Raoul shook his head. "No. And that's why we have to act quickly." That evening, Chuck and Malik watched an old cartoon they'd seen a dozen times. They laughed in the same spots. Nothing about the flight was mentioned. But before bed, Malik turned. "Thank you, Sophie, for Grandpa." "Grandpa, if someone does something wrong to me again, should I yell like Rosa or be quiet like you?" Chuck placed a hand on the boy's chest. "You do what you feel is right. But remember this. Sometimes silence helps us listen, and sometimes we speak, so others can't stay silent anymore." Bradley's letter. The next morning, Bradley submitted his resignation. Not a termination, a choice. Before leaving, he emailed the internal communications team. Subject line: "It's an apology not meant for one person, but for every voice that stayed silent, and every child who wasn't heard." He ended with, "I'm not afraid of losing my job. I'm afraid of losing the ability to look the child in the mirror in the eye." Full circle, Santa. 4 years passed. An early autumn afternoon blew through a quiet regional airport in Santa Fe. The air was dry and golden, tinged with the scent of fallen leaves. Families wheeled carry-ons past each other. An elderly couple giggled by the check-in kiosk like it was their honeymoon. In a tucked-away corner of the terminal, a small airport cafe buzzed with quiet hums and spoon clinks. Bradley sat alone. No uniform, no name tag, no polished shoes. Just a sweater, a mug of hot tea, and a quiet nervousness he couldn't name. He now worked for a volunteer training program. Kindness in service. There was no salary, no spotlight, but it was the first time in years he woke up without a knot in his chest. On the table before him was a stack of handouts, training materials about invisible power, unseen wounds, and how small acts can either harm or heal. He wasn't sure why today felt different. An itch in the air. Something was about to happen. And then he saw them. A boy around 10, with dark brown skin, curly hair, glasses, and a backpack with a wooden airplane keychain, walking beside an older man. Tall, upright posture, quiet presence, and that gaze. Bradley stopped breathing. The boy took a seat by the counter. The man studied the menu in silence. The boy held a notebook with a worn leather cover, wrapped in a clear plastic sleeve. It was Malik, and the man was still Chuck Norris. Bradley didn't plan to approach. But then Malik looked up right as Bradley glanced over, and he smiled. Not a knowing smile, not a forced one, just a normal, kind, open smile. Was it recognition, forgiveness, or just peace? Bradley stood, heart pounding, and walked slowly to their table. He stopped a few feet away and lowered his head. Mm. I'm sorry. What? I'm not sure if you remember me. Malik tilted his head. Are you? Bradley gave a soft, self-effacing smile. I used to be a flight attendant. On a flight where you sat next to your grandfather. And I was wrong. Malik didn't speak. Chuck, stirring sugar into his coffee, glanced over. He didn't look surprised. He didn't interrupt. Malik gently opened his notebook. He flicked to an old page. A child's handwriting, shaky but clear. Someone hurt me. But with Grandpa next to me, I wasn't scared. I learned that people who do wrong sometimes don't understand everything yet. Bradley swallowed hard. Thank you for not hating me. Malik shook his head. You know, that day I learned about silent strength. But now that I'm older, I think silence can also be a way to give others the chance to come back. Bradley almost couldn't speak. He turned to Chuck. Chuck gave a single nod. I don't need apologies. I need people who are willing to begin again. Silence. Not awkward. Just sacred. Then Malik said, I'm sharing that story with my friends next week. Not to shame anyone, but to show them not everyone who messes up is bad, and not everyone who's right is perfect. Bradley sat down. They shared the cafe table, not his former roles, just as people who had been hurt, people who had healed, people who were still learning. A week later, Bradley received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a color print from Malik's notebook. The old drawing, the hand gripping a wrist. But now, something new was written in green ink below it. The day he was wrong, but he came back. And for me, that was enough. Taped underneath, a quote, printed clearly. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering without anger. Closure. No lawsuits. No headlines. No courtroom scenes. Only change. A former flight attendant walked away from prestige and rewrote the way people were trained. An airline updated its ethics manual under a new section, Moral Conduct in Implied Authority. A blogger wrote, it was the loudest silence I've ever witnessed. And a boy 6 years old when it happened kept writing in his notebook. Everyone thinks Grandpa didn't do anything, but I think he taught them more than any words could. In a tucked-away cafe in Seattle, Bradley sat again one rainy evening. His coffee had gone cold. Before him, a blank sheet of paper. The heading read, Who have I become? It had been a week since the Santa Fe encounter. He was no longer the man with a name badge, no longer greeted by practiced smiles, no longer the center of a cavern lit with soft yellow lights and clinking drink trays. Now, the center was emptiness. And the question that haunts all of us when applause fades, who am I when no one is watching?